This is Guns Unpacked, a podcast where we interrogate, engage, and elevate the terms of the gun debate as we know it. I am your host, Jennifer Carlson, director of the Center for the Study of Guns and Society at Arizona State University. We are very privileged today to welcome Dr. Micheal Sierra-Arévalo, an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Texas at Austin. He is also affiliated with the Policing Project at New York University School of Law and the Justice Collaboratory at Yale Law School. And from 2020 to 2023, he served on the City of Austin's Public Safety Commission. He is a leading expert on policing, violence, and public safety, and his work has been featured in outlets such as the LA Times, the Washington Post, GQ, NPR, Vox, and many, many more. His 2024 book, which was just released, The Danger, Imperative, Violence, Death, and the Soul of Policing, shows how police culture's singular focus on officer safety drives police violence. It draws on over 100 interviews and 1,000 hours on patrol to provide a look behind the blue wall that not only illuminates how police violence happens, but also why. So welcome, Micheal, to the show. Is it okay that I call you Micheal?
I would prefer that you call me Micheal. Thanks for having me, Jenny. I appreciate it.
Your work on violence, or your interest in violence, actually initially started with an interest in community gun violence. So looking at how police and community stakeholders work together to limit, de-escalate, ameliorate gun violence. And then, as you write about in your book, Mike Brown was shot dead in the street by a Ferguson police officer, and everything changed, not just for the politics of the police, but also for your work. And at that moment, you write about how you realized you had a unique perspective, a unique set of skills that could illuminate police violence in a way that mere statistics could not. So can you tell us about the process of coming to this topic, how you found your research topic?
I mean, that's a pretty concise timeline for what happened. I went to graduate school in 2012. And when I landed in New Haven, Connecticut, the city was in the process of getting a violence reduction program off the ground. It was called Project Longevity. New Haven was the test site for what was going to be a statewide initiative, and it was based on what is known as focused deterrence, which is a reimagining of traditional deterrence that is very highly focused on very particular problems, in this case, gun violence, that we know from social science research is highly concentrated in a very small percentage of the population of any given community that is affected by community violence. And so I got involved with that work very early. And that's actually the context in which I met police officers for the first time in a non-enforcement context. I was generally struck by this tension that continues to this day, where the work that they were talking about, the reality of violence, and they knew street corners, and they knew addresses, and they knew street names and real names, and they talked in a very blasé way about the reality of violence. But the individuals themselves seemed very mundane. They reminded me of kind of my conservative friends' dads growing up in Texas. They were mostly white, a lot of bald heads and big biceps, but they were talking about their days off, and they were talking about overtime, and they were talking about their kids. That was something that stood out for me, even then when I wasn't really focused on policing, was these seem like really normal, regular people with a very special job. And the plan was to do an ethnography of the Focused Deterrence Violence Intervention Project. So I was going to talk to the men who were involved in the project. I was going to talk to prosecutors and police officers and community members. And that was the plan up until Michael Brown was killed. So I began doing what a lot of people began doing then, which was reading. And I, along with everybody else, really couldn't understand why I was reading op-eds that said that we didn't even know how many people were shot by the police. Remember, this is years before The Counted was produced by the Washington Post. This is years before other crowdsourced journalistic or nonprofit data sets were produced. And so as I read more, I began to see and learn that actually this problem goes back decades. We've been calling for that data set for many, many years. It's just never been produced. I kept reading, and the how and the why just became less and less clear to me as I read all these reports from all these commissions over the past half century, which were all calling for the same thing, decade after decade. Community policing kept being talked about as this solution decade after decade, and clearly it wasn't. And so I just grew skeptical that I was going to be able to answer my growing questions about how and why, how I was going to explain these mundane people that I was meeting in the context of Project Longevity were also part of this system of violence. And I didn't think I was going to be able to do it with statistics and administrative data sets and arrest records and stop records. And so I thought, you know what? I have the time. I have the beginning of what I would call training as a social scientist. So I'm just going to get in the car. And that's how I decided to answer the how and why of police violence from 2014 to 2018.
And it's incredible the amount of field work that you pulled off at this particular very politicized moment. So just to remind our listeners, 3 police agencies, 1,000 hours of police field work, plus over 100 interviews. And so I'm curious about how you entered the field. So on the one hand, I didn't get a lot of sense of the challenges that you met entering the field, like if you got no, how you overcame those challenges. So I'm curious if that happened. And then I'm also curious about how you built rapport. You mentioned that people thought you were a Fed, which is really interesting because we just interviewed Samantha Simon, who also just wrote a police ethnography book. And so she wrote a lot about how, everybody thought she was like, the liberal from UT Austin. I'm curious sort of how your process of gaining access unfolded.
So the initial access is always at the departmental level, at least in my experience. And there are 2 very different kinds of access and rapport building that I talk a little bit about in the methods appendix of the book. Initial access to the departments was itself not the hard part, which I think might surprise some people. Most departments have a ride-along program. There are very clear barriers to entry if you, for example, have a felony record. You're supposed to pass a background check. I've never been able to confirm if they actually did run that background check or was sort of just a way to keep people from even trying to go on ride-alongs. Most people can just go on a ride-along. I do it with my classes, for example. I send doctoral students to go on ride-alongs and take field notes to kind of see what policing looks like on the ground. The initial access to departments was something that I was able to achieve through leveraging of connections that I had built through my violence reduction work. So very early, I'd gone to multiple departments across the country. And so I sort of had the ability to say that I was interested in the same things police were, which was reducing violence. I have, in that way, a shared interest, a shared goal that I could leverage in my early conversations with them to say, look, like I'm not here to burn it all down. I'm actually interested in reducing violence too. Additionally, I would argue that my project was trying to provide an opportunity for departments to show people that this is not what they think it is, or at the very least, show them what it actually is, because I'm actually going to be there. I'm not a journalist. I'm not here to rake mud on police departments or policing more generally. Part of that pitch, and I think probably central to that pitch, was I'm not going to name the department. I talk about Elmont and West River and Sunshine. Those are all pseudonyms. And I think that was a preemptive attempt on my part to show departments, like, I'm not here from the local paper that you don't like. I'm not here to get people hemmed up with IA investigations. I'm here to understand what's actually happening. And so the initial access actually wasn't the hard part. And by the time I had done 2 field sites, my 3rd field site asked for a letter of recommendation. And that was actually very easy to get for them from a high-ranking administrator in my Western field site. Whether or not that factored into their decisions, I don't know. But they did ask for a letter of recommendation of sorts. And that brings me to the second piece, which is rapport with individual officers is a completely different ballgame. And in fact, mentioning that you have some sort of connection to the chief or the assistant chief that signed your paperwork is usually not a good way to build rapport with line level officers. And I learned that very quickly. Instead, my pitch for officers, usually it's in a lineup room. The sergeant says, oh, we have a researcher here. He's a doctoral student. Do you want to introduce yourself? I would stand up and I would just tell them who I was. I'm a doctoral student at Yale. I'm working on my dissertation. As I spent more time in the field, I could say I've done X hours, or I've already been to this department and this department. And then I would tell them, which is true, that I'm here to understand what your job is actually like. I hear from police chiefs, and I hear from activists, and I hear from academics, and I hear from politicians on all sorts of cable news programs, but I never hear from line level officers what it's like to be a police officer and to do police work. And that's why I'm here, and I need your help. Sometimes that was successful. Sometimes didn't matter what I said. I wasn't a cop, was never going to be a cop, and it didn't really matter what I said. And other times officers were very candid in saying, thank you for at least coming here to form your own opinion. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to show you what this job is actually like. So it was a mixed bag.
So let's get then into the heart of the book, into what you found, which is the soul of policing. I love that term. And so your entire book revolves around this concept of the danger imperative. It's the title of the book. One of the things you do really well at the beginning of the book is say, look, I know you've already heard that violence is a part of policing. You've read Bittner, you know the officer personalities, you've heard the tropes of the warrior and the guardian. But this concept of the danger imperative actually represents an analytical shift beyond the conversation we think we've already been having about violence and advances our understanding. So what is the danger imperative and how does it advance our understanding of police violence?
So the danger imperative in social science speak is a cultural frame. But to simplify that, it's a lens. It's a filter which officers are taught to use, in which they then deploy in the course of their work. Now, all of us have various frames or filters that we use in our lives. If you're a physician, you have been taught to see your work and to see the things that you encounter in your work in a particular way. You emphasize some things, you ignore others. You understand that there are correct and incorrect ways to address particular problems. The same thing happens for students. It happens for parents. It happens for anything that requires you to adjudicate what problems you're going to solve now, which ones you're going to ignore. That cuts across all facets of social life. And policing is no different. The distinction is that the danger imperative is a frame that specifically emphasizes violence and the necessity of ensuring officer safety at all times. So while we've had decades of work that tried to cut officers up into different types. So you have the hard charger, or you have the warrior, or you have the new centurion. And they say that, oh, well, the warrior is one kind of officer, and then there's the guardian kind of officer, or there's the hard charger, and there's the station queen. And the sort of analytic payoff of that is that you're saying, well, the warrior is the problem, but guardians are okay. The hard charger is the problem. The station queen is not as problematic because they're not as violent. And what the danger imperative tries to show is that the violence is the point. The violence is an intentional outcome of an entire institution. And so while I think you could argue that some officers, Officer Cisneros, for example, in Chapter 1 as a training instructor in Elmont, are sort of closer to the ideal type, which would constitute the warrior, I think it's a mistake to focus only on the most obvious examples of the danger imperative and its emphasis on violence run amok. Instead, all officers are part of the danger imperative. They all view their work through this frame that emphasizes violence. So it's much more a story of a system. It's much more a story of processes and rituals and probabilities than it is about essentially trying to identify bad apples.
And you actually had a tweet, although I'm not sure if we're allowed to call them tweets anymore, on X.
Please do.
Yeah, I don't know what they're called. You had something you wrote on this unnamed social media platform, and it was about U.S. Airman Aaron Bushnell. He set himself on fire. He died in front of the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C. to protest the war in Gaza. What you wrote about that, I want to ask you if you can explain what the police did, how they responded, because I think that incident, when people hear like, oh, it's a lens, it's a cultural frame. Yeah, I appreciate that. Like, that's sociology speak. But what it means to view the world through the lens of the danger imperative, I feel like this instance really, really captures it. So what happened and how does it reflect the danger imperative?
So the Bushnell case is interesting, and I've since gone back and done some more investigation into the case because the details at the beginning of that particular example were less clear. And I think that what happened was the person, in this case, the person who pointed a gun at the smoldering body of Bushnell as he was burning in front of the embassy, I believe was an Israeli security guard. Again, details about the specific identity of that individual are not clear. This points to, I think, a frame that transcends even American policing. It's something that might be described as applying to violence workers generally. So even security guards or people that work as bouncers, right? They're also going to be emphasizing violence and the need for safety at all times. I'm focused on police officers and how they go about using this particular frame. What I was pointing to in that particular tweet was the danger imperative, this frame that emphasizes violence and the need to ensure safety at all times. It's one that allows you to make sense of what from the outside looks like, frankly, a really ridiculous set of actions that are taken. Somebody holding at gunpoint a prone, I believe, dead or dying person who's literally on fire. It's not clear why you would point a gun at them at that point, but the danger imperative helps you make sense of that. It helps you make sense of, you know what, I don't actually know what to do right now. I'm going to point my gun at this thing because that's at least something that I can do that resonates within a set of logics that I've been trained to use in ways that can keep me safe at the very least, and ideally others. The example that I think comes to mind for me even more clearly, I forget where it occurred, but it was a police officer that was going to a call where they said, I believe there was a possibility of a weapon, and an acorn falls and it hits the top of a car. And the officer responds like he is under fire. He runs, he either trips, does some sort of combat roll, draws his weapon, unloads on this vehicle where there's currently a suspect in the back of the car. Another officer who's much more senior, he sees this going down. They draw, they shoot, and it was an acorn. And of course, from the outside, that might seem ridiculous. But once you understand how officers are trained, how they are socialized to understand the likelihood of violence and the necessity of treating that small probability with the utmost care, violent care specifically, you can understand why that series of events unfolded as it did.
So you are very direct also in terms of how racism operates within public law enforcement and how the danger imperative amplifies racism, amplifies white supremacy, but in no ways requires racism, right? So I think you're actually telling us two really important things. The first of which is kind of, at least for sociologists, this very familiar argument about colorblindness, that contemporary racism can take the form of colorblindness. It doesn't always, but racial disparities don't require racist people if the logics of racism are built into the structures of our institutions. So that's the first piece of it. But I think there's a second challenge that you're getting at, which I think is really crucial, which is that even without racism, prejudice, animus, whatever you want to call it, either at the individual or the structural level, the danger imperative is still going to be a problem when it comes to excessive police violence. So even if we could wave a magic wand, which we can't, and eliminate white supremacy, we would not have completely solved the problem of police violence. Can you unpack that for us? And also, I'm really curious to hear how your own ideas surrounding racism, white supremacy, colorblindness, and this idea of the danger imperative, the centrality of officer safety and violence in police work. I'm curious how your ideas developed over the course of the first time you got into the police car for your field work to wrapping up the book and really crystallizing your analysis.
I'll start with the first piece. And the second piece, I think, is I'm glad you asked. This is, I think, part of the... I don't talk about it as much in the book, but writing this book was something that was deeply influenced by the moment in which I was writing it. I was deep COVID, Floyd was murdered, the quote-unquote racial reckoning was in full flight, and I was trying to figure out how to write a book about police violence. So I'll start with the first piece. The danger imperative is notable in its simplicity, right? I describe it as a cultural frame which emphasizes violence and the need to ensure officer safety at all times. There is no mention of race anywhere in that. And as I describe in the book, no one talks about race. It's not in the training documents. It's not in their lineups, with the exception of describing suspects. So, for example, in West River, they get this printout of crimes that have occurred in the area, and they'll describe suspects as an MB, that's a male black. And so race is used only descriptively in terms of trying to find suspects, to describe crimes, things of that nature. And that is exactly why I think, and as I argue, that the danger imperative is something that is so difficult to even begin to have a conversation about in the context of race and structural racism. No one talks about race. You only use these essentially aracial terms: gun, threat, safety, tactics. These are the words that are used to build the danger imperative in the minds and actions of officers. That is precisely why I think it gets so much buy-in. It's why officers are so willing and able to talk about their work with these terms, because it allows them to simply avoid contending with the reality that when they say threat, more often than not, they are talking about a person of color with whom they are interacting. That idea of this sort of colorblind frame was something that developed as I talked with officers, and it was white officers and black officers and Latino officers. It was men, it was women, it was veterans, it was rookies. And if I asked about race, all they ever did was deny its salience, which is just classic colorblind racism. Like, oh, well, maybe it happens in other departments. It doesn't happen here. I've never seen it. They might devolve into very tired tropes about culture, which is just a coded way of saying the culture of Black people or Latino people or immigrants or what have you. But they were very willing to go into detail about tactics, about where they park their car, about furtive movements, about all these other things, which we know are tied to race. We know that racial biases are real. We know that Black people, particularly young Black men, are perceived as inherently more suspect, more dangerous, more violent, more criminal, more guilty. But that was not the conversation that was happening at all. And so when I say that the danger imperative is something that would continue to reify inequalities in policing, even if I were to snap my fingers, I have a perfect filtering mechanism for all the quote unquote racist bad apples, nothing else has changed. Segregation hasn't changed. Income inequality hasn't changed. Broken schools haven't changed. Mental health hasn't been addressed. And those are all the things that drive violence and drive calls for service. And so even if I get rid of the overtly racist cops, I'm still going to be sending officers into the same places to interact with the same people through the frame of the danger imperative. Layer on top of that biases about race, biases about gender. And of course, we're going to continue to see inequalities in who is the subject of police violence. So the second piece was, how did I come to this? Like, how did I develop this sort of...
I actually want to pause you because I actually feel like there's another piece that I thought was really important that... So there's the colorblind racism within policing. There's the overall structure of inequality and segregation and white supremacy in which policing operates. But then there's this third piece, which is this way in which law enforcement has become the go-to institution for every single social problem, right? So when you put officer safety in a problem that really is just school discipline, or it's a lost wallet, or, what have you, that you're still going to have excessive police violence. And those, the way I read it, that's even if you could, really radically transform society, you're still going to have too much police violence because of that last third piece. Or did I misread that?
No, I think it's a logical step. I know that in the back end of the book, I essentially conclude that, look, there's a couple of low-hanging policy levers that we can pull related to training, related to oversight of third-party trainers. And I say, yeah, we can and probably should do those things. But if you've read this book, I hope that your conclusion is, wow, just changing the training is not going to shift the number of things that are enervating and recreating the danger imperative. So I would argue for much more macro level changes in how we choose to address social problems. One of those is how you address violence. And I provide a list of evidence-based things that we can do, from, improving lighting, fixing the facades of broken buildings, planting some trees, mental health centers. So to your point, I think you're absolutely right, which is, even if you were to, again, wave your magic wand and remove racism, if you continue to send officers that are operating within the danger imperative to solve all social problems, you are inevitably going to be sending armed agents of the state preoccupied with their own safety above all else to deal with any number of things, from mental health to lost wallets to stolen cars. And that will inevitably lead to the use of violence in situations where there need not have been any violence. And more pointedly, there need not have been an armed agent of the state present in any way.
Well, how did that develop over the course of your field work? Did your ideas change, or did they really just crystallize? I'm always curious about this in terms of how people enter the field and are transformed by it.
So the initial project was intended to sort of get an idea of what does the practice of community policing actually look like. That was because of the conversations that were happening circa 2014, the 21st Century Task Force, like so many before it, and all, and our pundit class like the idea of community policing. It's very, it's very kumbaya. It's very, we can have like the policeman walking the beat again, and we can have, where he waves hi to the kids. And so I was like, okay, well, the evidence seems pretty thin on community policing, but I'll go and see what it looks like in practice. And all I got was boilerplate. They were essentially, quoting the main Elmont Police Department website to me. And so, okay, I'll change tacks. And I found some data on suicides about how officers take their lives at 5 to 6x the frequency at which they are killed by a suspect in the line of duty. So I began talking about suicide with them, or trying to anyways, because nobody wanted to talk to me about suicide. And if I had done more reading about suicide research, I would know that most people don't like talking about suicide. So maybe that wasn't surprising, but I just kind of kept asking now, how, and why. And officer safety became the thing. Everything somehow got tied back to officer safety. Why they handcuffed somebody, why they chose to stand here, why they parked there, what kind of calls this, everything came back to officer safety. So I knew that that was important. And I was sort of assuming that, well, I'm probably going to find variation if I change the department, or if I change the location of the department, or if I talk to more senior officers or more junior officers. And I think that what ended up happening was, though I was open to the possibility of there being, I found an officer that seems highly resistant to the power of the danger imperative. What I instead found, and I know that a lot of social scientists who are, deeply enamored with the idea of variation might not believe, but it was actually a story of consistency. It's not to say that everybody is Officer Cisneros, this tactical, high-speed trainer from Chapter 1, but I didn't meet a single officer who didn't think their job was dangerous. I didn't meet a single officer who told me that I don't really like officer safety is like so overblown, it's like whatever. I just didn't meet them. I think the main change was sort of trying to step back, and instead of really diving down on finding the officers that maybe would be the inconvenient interview for my theory about policing, was instead trying to really focus on the forest instead of the trees. That was a change that I think occurred as I just had more hours and more interviews and more field sites. Like, this is like really, really consistent across these sites.
Yeah, and this is a comment, not a question, but I just want to say that I really loved your defense of anonymizing the agencies, not just as a way to facilitate access, but that it was actually also an analytical decision, with the argument that if you name the jurisdictions, that it would actually make it all too easy for your reader to say, oh, well, the reason this happened is because of this chief or this high profile incident or whatever. And that actually, we are so eager to sort of have whatever we believe about policing. I think policing, guns, there's all these topics that, it's like you have the sociologist who does all the field work, but everyone thinks that they're an expert. And so almost like, I love the way you defend anonymizing, because it's actually a way for you to basically say, look, you're going to have to look at the data. Like, I'm not going to give you an out to try and argue out of what's actually going on here. So again, comment, not a question. I just thought that was just really cool. Okay, so you're very clear throughout the book that police work is dangerous. So you lay out all the stats, you kind of engage the arguments about, it's less dangerous than this, it's more dangerous than that. You give us like a very objective mapping of the terrain in terms of danger in police work. You're not trying to say that there aren't elements that bring danger into the profession of the police. And so I think it's really crucial that you're not just trying to kind of engage the fact of danger, but actually take, as you've already mentioned with thinking about this, from a cultural lens perspective, how that sense of danger takes shape and what kinds of dangers are amplified and which kinds of dangers are not. And so the two that stick out, I think, obviously in the book are suicide and seatbelts. And so I want to talk about both of those. And so suicide first, you talk about this in the context of how death is memorialized within police agencies. And you basically say, there's something very odd going on, which is that police deaths are a constant presence, but only certain police deaths. And as you just mentioned, suicides outnumber other kinds of deaths and are essentially erased. So can you tell us how death becomes memorialized, how it fits into the danger imperative, and how officer suicides just simply do not fit into this culture of memorialization?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked about it. It's not a super long section of the book, but it is something that stuck out very, very starkly as I went from department to department. For listeners, you've undoubtedly seen indicators of these commemorations. You've seen examples of them. The black band that you might see an officer wearing across their badge, that is a ubiquitous symbol for the death of a police officer. What you don't know is if it's a local officer, a nearby agency. It might get worn during September 11th to commemorate the NYPD officers that were killed in those attacks. Officers across the country put on black mourning bands on their badges after the attack on Dallas, which is now the single deadliest day for law enforcement since 9/11. If you've ever seen a memorial wall for police officers, that is a very overt commemoration of their deaths. And sometimes you don't even know that it's a memorial wall. Sometimes it's a plaque. Sometimes it's a statue. And so people have seen these things. What I don't think I was prepared for was just how ubiquitous they are once you get past the lobby. They are everywhere. It is framed pictures. It is SWAT helmets that have had the name of an officer that was killed in the line of duty spray painted on them. It is wristbands. So once you get close to officers, you can see they're wearing wristbands that commemorate their deaths. Or if you get close to cars in the motor pool, you might see there's a vinyl sticker with the name of an officer who was killed in the line of duty on those cars. There are glass cases by the kitchen that have etchings of their name on the memorial in Washington, D.C., and teddy bears and memorial coins and T-shirts. It's just everywhere. It's even in their homes. But there's no recognition of officers that commit suicide, at least that I've seen. And there are some departments. I've seen blog posts and edits about officers that are commemorated now. They might change the rules locally within a given department to honor those officers. But importantly, the national memorial has made no such change. Those are only officers that were killed by the hand of somebody else or in, say, an accident. A car accident, for example, is very common. I think that this is part and parcel of maintaining the simplicity of the danger imperative. And by extension, having very simple stories that officers can tell themselves and tell each other about what their job is and why they do it. Because if the drive to catch the bad guys and lock them up and confront danger, to run towards the gunshots, as they will often talk about, if that also comes at the cost, far more often, of officers taking their own lives with their own firearms, suddenly the mission, the whole endeavor, is a little less easy to understand. It gets a little bit more complicated if you begin to honor officers that did not, some officers might argue, embody the ideals of courage and strength and duty. There's very perverse language that gets used about suicide generally, right? It's about weakness. It's about softness. It's about not having what it takes to do the work. And if you let that death exist alongside an officer that died while performing the work in a highly curated way that aligns with ideals of heroism and courage and valor and sacrifice, one could argue that that heroic death becomes cheapened, that heroic death can now be interpreted as something that is equivalent to a suicide. And then we begin to wonder what actually drives suicides and these deaths. And it becomes the institution. It becomes something that the institution simply can't do anything about. It leaves officers powerless. And so that is why I argue that suicide is just not a part of those commemorations. It's not something that officers can hold up in esteem and still keep these very simple but very powerful stories about what police work really is.
You know, what this kind of brings to mind is the fact that mental health has mental illness, mental health struggles. There's a huge stigma on having mental health struggles throughout U.S. society, but particularly among police. You're obviously the expert on this, but, you know, my sense is that when officers are involved in violence on the job, and there's what anywhere else would be a traumatic event where obviously there would be counseling and therapy. That kind of the sense is, go home and spend time with your family and figure it out. When you get it together, come back and rejoin us. Does the danger imperative actually give us yet another insight into why mental health is so stigmatized, or mental health struggles are so stigmatized within policing?
That's an interesting question. If I had to venture a guess, it's that the simplicity of the danger imperative, as I've defined it, makes it such that you can argue that whatever you want to occur is necessary to abide by the strictures of the danger imperative, and it allows you to ignore the things that you don't care about. And so what do I mean by that? I mean that, for example, there's sort of an inertia that the danger imperative is a part of within the institution of policing. And so the danger imperative, perhaps unsurprisingly, is something that is reified by officers and leadership through some very predictable avenues. More tactics training, new weapons, armor, disbursements from the Department of Defense through the 1033 program, including armored vehicles and rifles and all kinds of other things that align with a particular view of what the correct way, the valorous, heroic way is to address the problem of violence. And left on the wayside is an emphasis on things like mental health, an emphasis on things like, I don't mean tactical fitness. Not everybody needs to be a shredded SWAT operator, but just like not morbid obesity, which is a big problem within policing. They're not talking about cortisol in sleep. Those conversations are happening, particularly within organizations like the IACP or the Police Executive Research Forum. And to the credit of the departments that I was in, they all have some version of essentially a peer support group with a list of officers that, as far as I know, are largely untrained in matters related to mental health and trauma, but which would theoretically be able to offer some kind of support in the aftermath of either being the victim of violence or an officer that was engaged in an act of violence that left somebody very injured, or usually it's in the case of a fatal use of force. But that's not the same thing as robust mental health care. And there are some departments that have, for example, like mandatory mental health assessment after something that they'll call a critical incident. Again, usually something like a lethal use of force. But this is something that's highly inconsistent across departments. There are approximately 17,500 departments in the US. There is no federal statute that says that officers involved in a lethal use of force must be assessed for X number of months or directly afterwards, or they must receive certain kinds of care. It's not something that is emphasized nearly as much as officers' ability to protect their physical bodies through violence. The mental side of the equation, if it's talked about at all, tends to be about perceptual strategies to identify threats and address threats. And much less emphasized is how to take care of basic things, basic wellness, to ensure that officers who probabilistically are very unlikely to get involved in a lethal force incident can simply have robust mental health care with the rest of their very, very trying job.
So the second example that really sticks out is seatbelts. Okay. You knew we were going to go here. So seatbelts are, as you describe it, it's a really fascinating example because when people think about danger on the job, they're not thinking about seatbelts. That's not where their minds go at all. And yet you actually point out, and I think this is really interesting to think about in terms of the memorialization of officer deaths, that many of these deaths are not sort of the violent deaths that we imagine, again, the public imagines, but they're actually accidents. They're car accidents. And seatbelts, as you argue, could do a lot to actually save officers' lives. And yet there is resistance to using a seatbelt among police. So why is this so? And how does the danger imperative sort of resolve the puzzle of police resistance to seatbelt use?
The resistance to seatbelt use, I think, is related to why you don't see officer suicides commemorated on the same walls as those who were killed in the line of duty in other ways, including, I might add, in car accidents. And it's because seatbelts don't align within the frame of the danger imperative. Recall that the frame, another way to think about it, is a filter. It's something that lets certain things pass through for you to perceive them and do something about. And by extension, it also filters some things out. And the things that get filtered out, those are things that don't align with a lot of the values, the narratives, the assumptions that build that frame in the first place. So central to the danger imperative is the assumption that the number one thing that you're concerned with is violence at the hand of another person. Seatbelts don't fit particularly well within that frame. And so what I found when I was on duty with officers is the vast majority of them just don't wear their seatbelt. And this kind of stood out to me, and I would just ask them why, and the answers were remarkably similar. The idea is that a seatbelt is a hindrance to officers who are trying to instantaneously assess a violent threat. And so they would say the seatbelt, one officer kind of pointed down to his waist, like, oh, I got all this gear down here, and if I got a seatbelt on, it might prevent me from getting to my firearm. Or it might get hung up, the duty belt or their radio or whatever else might get hung up on the seatbelt as they're trying to jump out of a car to either assist another officer whose life is in danger or to address a violent threat which has presented itself directly in front of them. And so they just leave the seatbelt off. It is understood as an unacceptable safety problem to have a seatbelt on. Of course, the probability of encountering an armed gunman is far lower than the probability of simply getting into a car accident when you spend 40 to 60 hours a week driving around, much less when you are driving around at high rates of speed, often without using your lights and your sirens as you're actually required to do by policy. You don't emphasize the seatbelt because that is not the kind of danger that is at the heart of the danger imperative, which is at the heart of how officers understand their work as this never-ending battle between them and violence, between good and evil, between the blue line and chaos.
So the richness, as I'm sure listeners can already tell just by this point in the conversation, the richness of your fieldwork is just amazing. Reading this book, I think that, oftentimes we as professors, as researchers, we're like, show, don't tell, and it sounds really great, but then you're like, okay, how do I do that? That's a great thing, but how do I do it? Anytime anybody's like, I don't know how to think about showing rather than telling, this is the book. It is so packed with so much just rich data, examples from the use of your unpacking of the Punisher as a police icon. Absolutely loved it. Your observations of the use of seatbelts, all of this. It's such a compelling read. What I want to talk about is actually one of the examples that really stuck out, and it really sort of illuminates something that we see over and over and over in the book that I think really sort of illuminates this, what you've already said, which is training is not the only answer, or training seems like the panacea, but it's not the panacea we think it is. And you kind of just said it in your last answer, which is that, it just seems like no matter what kind of policy gets asserted or proclaimed or, whatever, that officer safety seems to always trump policy. The top down, the top brass are saying do this and that. If the line officers can say no, but officer safety, that seems to always be able to trump policy. And we see that with seatbelts, as you just said. In the book, you write about sort of Code 3 officer responses and high-speed car chases. And there's another example where I think this really comes out super clearly, and I want to unpack it for our listeners. And so it involves Officer Baker, who I think might be from Sunshine, but I can't remember exactly what.
Yeah, Sunshine training officer, yeah.
Okay, awesome. So it's a virtual reality simulation of a police encounter. And so someone in the simulation comes out to their front porch, they're armed, they're threatening police. And basically you say that had the simulation just sort of played out, I guess, as intended by whoever created this, actually, the trainee could have talked him down and the trainee would have been successful. The person would not have shot at the officer. And it almost seems like, that's the point of this exercise, at least as the person who created it, show the officer that de-escalation can work, that using your words can work. Except that's not at all what actually happens in the training. And in fact, the absolute opposite lesson is gleaned from this training. So can you talk us through what actually happens and how, again, this demonstrates the danger imperative, and not just its consequences and how officers respond to threat, but also how it really kind of upends what we think of as the utility of training and officer accountability.
Sure. I'll set the stage. So I was at in-service training, which is not with recruits, it's with active duty police officers, and they have to periodically go through state-mandated training hours to continue to have their certification as peace officers in the state. And as part of this in-service training, there's live fire, and that happens outside on an actual firing range. And then inside, they have these virtual shoot, don't shoot scenarios, that's shorthand, where officers practice how they would go about engaging in an interaction. And they are supposed to use de-escalation. They're able to, if they choose to say, oh, at this point I would draw my OC or I would draw my taser, whatever. And there are very fancy versions of this now. Companies like Vertra have huge DoD contracts. They produce them for the military. They produce them for police departments. VR is increasingly being used. This particular system that I was looking at is much more simple by comparison. It's essentially a projector screen with a projector that puts video onto it in 2 dimensions. There's an ancient computer that is run by Officer Baker, who is the training instructor for this particular training. And each one of these scenarios that's been pre-recorded has branches. What that means is that over the course of that video scenario, Officer Baker has the ability to change what happens on the screen, either in response to what an officer does or based on what they want the officer to confront. And so in this particular example, it's an argument between a tenant and their landlord. The officer that I'm observing shows up. They're screaming at each other about rent or what have you. He tries to separate them, which is what you want to do usually with an argument. If people are about to come to blows or shouting at each other, training would just tell you to separate them. At which point the guy who's on the stairs, he says, do something about this guy or I will. And he storms inside. Officer Stewart then calls after him, telling him, hey, come back out here. Again, this is perfectly in line with training. As an officer, you are trained not to let people leave and go to places that you can't see because they could be grabbing weapons or they could be lighting the bomb, like whatever. You don't let them leave. Eventually, the man does come back out, except this time he's carrying a shotgun. And at this point, Officer Stewart has drawn his infrared pistol. He shouts at him, put the gun down, and less than 2 seconds later fires 2 rounds. The 2 rounds show up on the man's chest as dots, and the scenario's over. And so there's always a debrief after the scenario has ended. And Officer Baker explains to Stewart, well, actually, I ask first, like, tell me what you were thinking. And Stewart says, I told him to put the gun down. He didn't. At that point, I would fear for my life. That was the very straightforward logic. And Baker helped understand sort of how he was thinking about as an instructor, what he was seeing. And he explained, well, the point of that scenario is that he doesn't actually pick the gun up at you. So Baker is like telling me and Stewart, well, I'd selected a branch of that particular scenario where he wasn't going to actually point the gun. And yet Baker found all kinds of ways to understand it and make sense of and justify Stewart's decision. He says something to the effect of who comes out of a house with a gun with 2 cops standing there? And if he does pick it up, how long would it actually take him to get that gun downrange pointed towards Stewart? Less than half a second. I am not going to critique that shoot. I think that was reasonable. I think that that's a good shoot. What this whole scenario, I think, highlights is that whether or not the man in the scenario actually pointed the gun at Stewart is, from a policy, practice, and legal perspective, frankly irrelevant. Officers are taught, just like Stewart is by Baker, just as is written into case law in Graham v. Connor, that perception is king. The fact that he didn't actually point the gun at Stewart is kind of besides the point. What's more important is that he could have, and that a reasonable officer like Stewart would interpret the possibility of him pointing the gun at him as something that would reasonably be addressed with the use of lethal force. And that is something that no training is really going to get around because it is, frankly, the law of the land. That's Graham v. Connor. That's Supreme Court. That is not something that is going to be changed by procedural justice. That's not something that's going to be changed by body cameras or cultural sensitivity or whatever other new training is being sold to police departments and paid for with tax dollars.
And so what you get out of this book, I think, is you realize that there's a different puzzle, that the puzzle you thought going into this book, you actually come out and ask not the question of why are police responding to everything through the lens of officer safety and with the tools of violence, not necessarily using violence, but like you said, that the possibilities there. It shifts to, well, then what about these cases where police are not rushing into danger, are not rushing to the use of force? And of course, that leads us to the police response at the Uvalde school shooting in May of 2022. How does the danger imperative relate to that lack of police response? What does it tell us about maybe the limits of the concept or the limits of police violence, the police use of force?
The Uvalde case, I think, reveals a couple of things. One, the danger imperative is a concept and it is real. It is also fundamentally a story. It's a narrative about what policing is. And most of police violence, as I describe in the book, is actually not shootouts. It's not barricaded suspects. Most violence in policing is low level. It is grabbing, it is handcuffing, it is pushing. An even smaller subset is punching and kicking and grappling. An even smaller subset of that is tasers. And then an even smaller subset of that is pointing guns and shooting guns. What Uvalde, I think, shows is that as powerful as the frame of the danger imperative is for structuring the day-to-day quotidian use of police violence, it runs into the reality of very, very intense violence, and it doesn't necessarily provide a cohesive way for officers to understand what they should be doing. What do I mean by that? Recall that the danger imperative is about the preoccupation with violence and the maximization, the insurance of officer safety. What we saw happen at Uvalde between the wholesale breakdown of communication from the very top to the very bottom, there was, I would argue, a preoccupation with officer safety, which was working very much as it was intended. The difference, of course, is that active shooter response training, active shooter drills emphasize that officers are supposed to neutralize a threat immediately. I'm not the only one seeing that the danger imperative or the emphasis on officer safety seems to have short-circuited that particular response. In fact, the DOJ report that came out after Uvalde specifically emphasizes that all other concerns, including, and it names it, officer safety, are less important than finding the threat and neutralizing it. I think that what we saw there is a tragic but not entirely unexpected outcome of the danger imperative. If you tell officers from the day that they enter the academy until the day they retire, and 99% of them will never encounter an active shooter, and most of those will never encounter real gunfire, real violence directed at them in that way, they're going to default to what they've been doing in many cases for years or decades. They're going to ensure their safety first. And I think that's what we saw happening. We saw leaders and we saw line level officers maximizing their safety, and children died as a result.
Yeah, and I think that, just thinking about how the danger imperative sort of shifts the conversation with regard to the warrior mentality and all of that, and this idea of the police being militarized and the police looking more and more like the military, I feel like that individualism represented by officer safety, that is really a distinguishing characteristic of the danger imperative vis-a-vis militarization or the warrior or what have you. I mean, it's interesting to me, coming from the perspective of thinking a lot about gun rights and gun culture, that, you really have sort of armed private civilians, Second Amendment, all of that, gun culture, you have policing, and you have the military. And these are all spaces where you have sort of legitimate or legitimated violence happening, or the possibility thereof, but how sort of the collective versus the individual interface in these are very, very different. And so this isn't really question as much as a comment. But I think what you get at with the danger imperative is really what is so distinctive about the logic of legitimate violence within policing vis-a-vis these other two sort of institutional cultural spaces.
I think that's right.
So
I think that's right.
I have, and I'm like so bummed because I feel like I've barely scratched the surface of the questions that I've wanted to ask you. But what I want to actually, as we're winding down, kind of think through the sort of methodological insights that you offer at the end of the book. And I know, I mean, the methods appendix, I love it. There's so much in there. There's a piece where you talk about the question of what would you have done if you saw violence during your fieldwork, if you saw police perpetrating brutality, if you saw violence against police. And basically you say, I never had to deal with that, which should tell us something about police work and violence in police work. So let's highlight that. But then you also do something that I think is really compelling, which is that you basically say, I don't know what I would have done. Any ethnographer who says that they would know ahead of time how they would respond to that situation is probably lying. That I super appreciated that. But I was wondering, thinking about that, I, of course, having just read the bulk of the book about the danger imperative, I was like, is this a rejection of the danger imperative? Is this an internalization of the danger imperative? Maybe this has nothing to do with the danger imperative, but it did get me thinking about how the danger imperative might have gotten into your psyche, if it did at all. And so I'm curious, I mean, this is kind of a particular version of asking the question, how did the fieldwork change you?
Yeah, for sure. So a couple of things. I definitely saw violence. And I think that's another sort of key takeaway from the book. And I'm influenced by, I think it's the most influential footnote I've ever read. And I think it was, I want to say it was either Harmon or Stoughton in one of their articles. They explained why they use police violence as their term in their paper as opposed to force. And I believe that their articulation is correct, which is that force, intentionally or not, distances us from the practical reality of what's happening when we talk about policing. And so it's very easy to talk about force that somehow seems distinct from violence. But violence, if you want to define it as using your body or some technology to coerce the behavior of another at the risk of injury or death, all of what police do that is force is violence. And that can be pushing, pulling, punching, handcuffing, pointing guns, pointing tasers. That's all violence. And it's not a value judgment. It's an observation of fact. That is violent behavior. Whether or not you want to justify it as legitimate because it's used by a state agent or because they're under threat, what have you, it is violence. So I did see violence. I think that the change that I observed in myself had a lot less to do with violence per se. I think that I was surprised by how quickly the violence of policing became normalized for me. I don't think I ever really felt, beyond the first couple of times that I saw it, adrenaline kick in any way. I saw that most of the times, the vast majority of times, when officers chose to use violence, it was usually very quick. Violence is always ugly, but then it was usually over. Most people don't fight back with the police. Most people don't have knives and guns stashed on them. And so I began to see even that level of, again, it's violent, but that was just very normal. That was something that, frankly, was like, that's a very logical way for this particular interaction to go, given what I've seen. But it did shift, for example, how I began to interpret other interactions that, like, say, didn't get violent. One call in Sunshine, there was a report of a stabbing that had taken place. Officers, we were eating lunch. They stop lunch, jump in the car, drive. They find the suspects. It's a couple of people. I think it's like 2 men, 1 woman, if I recall correctly. And at one point, the officers have guns drawn because they might have a deadly weapon on them. And they're sort of moving towards them. I've been told to stay by the car. And I see the woman reach into her bag, her purse. And the thought crosses my mind, like, oh my God, they're going to shoot her. She's like reaching for something in her bag. And I guess they didn't see her or they did see her and didn't think that it was a threat, but she like pulls out a knife and like tosses it towards one of the people that she's with. Why she did it, I don't know. Maybe it was to get rid of the evidence, unclear. But in that moment, I realized that I was beginning to think about how would I interpret what I am seeing as an officer and potentially, in that case, a threat that I would address with lethal violence. Or when I encountered a woman in West River who was panhandling on the side of the highway with a baby. And records showed that she had been contacted by the state patrol multiple times. The officer that I was with decides, all right, that kid's going to Child Protective Services. Fast forward a little bit, I'm translating. She speaks Spanish, I speak Spanish. She's obviously distraught. By that point, a sergeant has shown up, and now dad shows up out of nowhere. He's arrived, and he is, as you might imagine, very irate at the idea that his child is going to be taken from me. And I'm in this weird position in the middle where I have to translate what's happening. And the officer, the sergeant in this case, is saying, get this guy to calm down. There's a very pointed, unspoken or else at the end of that. The guy is telling me how upset he is. I'm trying to get him to calm down. He's getting mad at me, saying why would I, what do you mean calm down? And in the back of my mind, I know the score here. I know that if he doesn't calm down, this whole interaction could go all kinds of sideways. I'm not patting myself on the back, but by the end of the conversation, things have kind of calmed down. But I think that, if anything, is how my own perspective shifted, was recognizing in an interaction with a police officer, if they can interpret you as a threat, if they can articulate that you are raising your voice, or you are not listening, or you are not complying, there is a very real possibility of violence. And that is something that I think has stayed with me since, even recognizing that most of the violence is not deadly. There are many cases where officers don't use violence that they could. I think I have changed how I see the world insofar as I now understand that it doesn't take a lot for someone to understand that you pose a physical threat to them, including when we're thinking about police officers.
So this is a book that anyone who wants to understand the significance of guns in U.S. society absolutely must read. But do you consider yourself a gun scholar?
So I don't think it's my headline description of myself, though I know that I have said and continue to say that I study policing, firearms, and violence prevention. I think more fundamentally, I consider myself a sociologist who studies violence and culture. It just so happens that in the U.S. context,
that means guns.
Violence and culture means guns.
Yeah.
If you study organizations, I think there's probably few examples of culture and violence intersecting as police. I don't label myself as such, but I don't in any way resist the label, only because if you study policing and violence, if you're not talking about guns, frankly, I'm a little skeptical about how you're opining on the topic.
And so I'm curious, I know you have a lot of work in the pipeline. I don't want to do that thing where I'm like, great, you wrote this, now what's next? But,
Sure.
That's the curse for someone who writes such an excellent book, which I actually did not even mention this. I can't believe I left this out of your bio, that this book has already won an award. It's been out like a matter of months. It won the Distinguished Book Award from the ASA, American Sociological Association, a section on the sociology of law. So congratulations. So great, you won an award. Your book is an award-winning book. It's awesome. Now tell us what you're doing next, because we want more.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the shout out. I was very happy to win the award. And for any grad students listening, that's the first award I've ever won. So it took a while. The next book, for better and for worse, I do have a new book project. I've been sort of working on it slowly in the background. It's a direct result of diving deep into policing. The book is tentatively titled "It Came Wrapped in the Flag: The Militarization of Public Life and the Future of American Fascism." I am focused on a group of people that I am tentatively calling violence entrepreneurs, or more importantly, military entrepreneurs. And so I'm interested in the intersection of the global war on terror, specifically soldiers coming back from the global war on terror, often who are part of a supercharged special forces community, which received massive increases in funding after 9/11. And they're coming back to a world fundamentally reshaped by the internet and social media. And the thrust of the book, as I'm imagining it kind of before I've written a single chapter, is that we've always had soldiers come back. The U.S. has a long and torrid history of war. And some of those soldiers have come back, and some of them became congresspeople. Some of them become local leaders. Some of them, just don't actually ever talk about the military ever again. And some of them have even opened up training facilities. That's not a new phenomenon either. The difference is that we have more special forces operators than ever before coming home, and they have access to a set of tools that allow them to spread and advertise and sell the aesthetic and ethos of the military in any number of ways. And so that manifests not only in training courses, which can teach you things like close quarters battle or emergency preparedness. It's also in the creation of these so-called man camps. You can have a former Navy SEAL teach you how to be a better father and how to be a better entrepreneur. You keep going down this rabbit hole and you very quickly get to vaccine conspiracy theories. You get to denial of the Joe Biden election. You get to stop the steal. And you go a little bit further and now you're in Proud Boy Oathkeeper territory. And just a few more clicks and you find yourself in full-blown white supremacist neo-Nazi territory. But it's not just about the sharks. For me, it's about the water that we're all swimming in. And so Hollywood is a part of the story. Call of Duty is a part of the story. John Wick movies. 511 as the clothing brand that everyone can see walking around, or even more popular, the grunt style t-shirts of cross muskets and flags. The Punisher is a part of the same story. And so this book is trying to say that, frankly, what's happening in policing is just a symptom of something that's much, much deeper and much more fundamentally tied to our infatuation with warfare and militarism more broadly in the United States.
Well, you say that you're not headline gun scholar, but I can't imagine that the AR-15 isn't going to be a star player in the story that you're telling. This sounds like the book we need to read about gun culture 3.0. So thank you for sharing that. And can you please write that book like right now? But given that but in the meantime, can you give us a reading recommendation? We'll read your book. What are you reading now? What should we be reading? What can you recommend?
Currently on my reading list, I know you've already had Samantha Simon on your podcast, but I finished the book Before the Badge. Highly recommend that for those interested in police training, which is only one chapter of my book. She does multiple academies, and it's a fascinating dive into why training will not save us, essentially, is my summary of the book. I'm also reading Police in the Empire City, A Race and the Origins of Modern Policing in New York by Matthew Gariglia. It is a historical account of how the earliest versions of policing in New York, unlike today, very overtly talked about race and dealt with race in very particular ways designed to ostensibly keep people safe and deal with cultural differences, but actually just reify the sense that different people of different races should be policed differently. So those are two books that I'm working through right now. I probably should stop reading exclusively policing and gun books because it's kind of a downer, if I'm honest. I need to read some fiction.
Yeah. Well, there's lots of gun fiction. You can read that too. So
Sure, for sure. I can definitely.
You can play some.
Yeah, sure.
You can play some VR. You can play some video games. You know, you can find guns. Yeah, everywhere. Thank you so much, Micheal. The Danger Imperative: Violence, Death, and the Soul of Policing. Get this book. Read this book. It's awesome. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Jenny. I appreciate you having me.
Thank you for listening. This has been Guns Unpacked, and I've been your host, Jennifer Carlson, the director of the Center for the Study of Guns in Society at Arizona State University. You can learn more about our center and all we do at csgs.asu.edu. Music in this episode is by Blue Dot Sessions. This episode was produced by Regina Ravazova.